Hello, welcome. This is a history of modern philosophy, and I'm Mark Thorsby. In this video today, we're going to be taking a look at some of the work of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. GWF Hegel, very, very important philosopher. So if you've been following the series, you know that previously we looked at Immanuel Kant's transcendental idealism. What we're going to see today is Hegel is fairly well known for what we might call absolute idealism. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. I will say, just from the beginning here, that if you thought Kant was difficult last time, you're going to find that Hegel is extremely difficult to understand, partially because he's trying to articulate something that is very difficult to articulate, but also, on the other hand, that raises questions. I think that the difficulty of his work raises questions about whether or not it fully succeeds as the explanatory model for understanding consciousness and the process by which consciousness evolves out of history. So anyway, let's sort of jump into it. Let's start with a couple of the biographical elements related to Hegel. Is sort of taking a couple of the key dates out of his life. Of course, remember, there's a lot more to Hegel than this, so I encourage you to do your own research. You can read your own biography. You should also read his work directly. So Hegel was born in Stuttgart, Germany in 1770. In fact, when he was a kid, his mother taught him Greek, and so he grew up reading the ancient Greeks, and so that may be an indication to why his thought is so monumental, I think. In 1788, he began studying theology at the University of Tübingen. And while he was there, he was friends with both Holderlin and Schelling, the famous poet as well as the famous philosopher. So he was acquainted with, as is not too uncommon from these great philosophers, he was acquainted with the other great intellectuals of his era. In 1799, he became a non-salaried lecturer at the University of Jena. So he wasn't making any money, but while he was there, he began writing in the Phenomenology of Mind, which ultimately includes the Phenomenology of Spirit, which what we're going to be looking at here today. And then after this period, he needed a job, so he became a principal at a local high school. I don't know if local is the right term there, but he became a principal at a high school for quite a long time, I believe about 16 years. While he was there, he got married, had 2 kids, and that sort of thing. By 1816, though, he left the high school and joined the faculty at Heidelberg, while he was there, he wrote The Science of Logic. And within 2 short years, he was appointed the prestigious chair of philosophy at the University of Berlin, where he remained ultimately to his death in 1831. He dies from cholera. In 1821, he did write the Philosophy of Right. So you can see here I've highlighted these 3 major texts of Hegel's. Ironically, even though today we're going to be looking at the Phenomenology of Spirit, in particular, we're going to be looking at a text that's often referred to as the master-slave dialectic, or the lordship and bondage passage from the Phenomenology of Spirit. Oftentimes, I recommend highly that people take a look at his introduction to the history of philosophy, which I find to be much more palatable, especially for the introductory student into Hegelian studies. Now, I will say that I am myself not a Hegelian, and so I'm not a Hegelian, so there's a certain degree of specificity and depth that maybe my discussion today is going to lack because I'm not a Hegelian. So there's always more to do, more research for you to do. So let's start with here a way of situating Hegel in terms of what we've looked at in the previous lecture in terms of Kant. If you remember, Immanuel Kant in his transcendental idealism distinguishes 2 different major terms: the noumenon from the phenomenon. The phenomenon are the appearances as appearances, and the noumenon refer to the things as they are in themselves. You'll recall, hopefully, that Kant argued that the noumenon can never be understood in and of itself. That is, what something is in and of itself as an existing thing can never actually be known. It is unknown unto itself. But the thing is, Kant argued, regardless of the fact that we can't know what a thing is in itself, he argued that the noumenon must be responsible for the appearances or for the phenomena that we experience. So this means that the noumenon, on the one hand, is unknown to itself, and on the other hand, it causes the appearances of the things that we're perceiving. Now, this doesn't make any sense from Hegel's perspective, because what Hegel thinks is, wait a second, if it's unknown to itself, then it truly, strictly should be unknown. If it's unknown, then you cannot postulate that it is the cause of the appearances we're experiencing because of this unknownness, right? So what you have here in Hegel is, first off, a rejection of this transcendental idealism and a rejection of the type of transcendental metaphysics that Kant is trying to describe, and we looked at that in terms of the prolegomena. But what we see here is a movement in Hegel from transcendental idealism into absolute idealism. We're going to see Hegel ultimately transform the Kant's categories of mind into a system of absolute idealism. So Hegel, you'll recall that previously in our lecture on George Berkeley, we talked about idealism. But that was a sort of idealism from the beginning. What we see with Hegel is a much more rigorous and I think sophisticated form of idealism. It's very difficult to understand when one first reads it. We're going to see that his ultimate argument seems to be that consciousness and the ideas of consciousness are ultimately the product of a movement historically of the social process, and that ultimately the reality of things, insofar as it's given to us, is a consequence of this dialectical process, or a dialectical process. What we're going to look at today is really trying to articulate what this dialectical process looks like. So there's a couple key ideas I want to mention before we get into our discussion, particularly regarding the master-slave dialectic. The first are a couple critical ideas that are really, I think, essential when it comes to thinking about Hegel's philosophy. The first is Hegel recognizes what we call the dialectical method as being part and parcel to the very process by which ideas and reality unfurls. Now, dialectic here, we haven't done a lot of discussion of the dialectical so far in this video series, but the dialectical refers to really the means by which the opposition between things can give rise to something that's uniquely new. For instance, think about the Socratic method. Think about when two people get together and discuss an idea. If they're having an authentic conversation, what you'll find is that one person may think one thing, the other person will think the opposite thing, but through the engagement and through the discussion, through this this dialectical process, a third unified position emerges. And we're going to see that this actually is the model that he's talking about when he looks at self-consciousness in the master-slave dialectic. But it's also, fundamentally, for Hegel, it is the logic of history itself. In other words, within Hegel's overall metaphysical system, and within his overall philosophical theory, history is ultimately a story about the development of consciousness over time. Hegel thinks that human beings are a species being, so for him, an analysis of what it means to be human is ultimately an analysis of what it means to be what the human species means. And part and parcel of that species being is its history. In other words, Hegel doesn't focus on the individual, but rather focuses on the collective whole, as it were. So history is very violent. So, for instance, one of the things that Hegel says in his introduction to the philosophy of history is that history is a slaughter bench. And think about it, it certainly is true. Think of all of the nightmarish history that all of us have, that all of our cultures have as part and parcel to them. Think of the Holocaust. Think of the 30 Years' War. Think of any of the other myriad events that's taken place in history, and think about how individuals are often just slaughtered or sacrificed in these long-term historical processes. How can we make sense of these? Well, ultimately, Hegel's view, and this is what he sets forward in the Phenomenology of Spirit, is that ultimately he thinks that through ultimately the inorganic life and ultimately to, I'm sorry, beginning with the inorganic lifeless and then building slowly into a development of life and the multiplicity of life forms that we see developing over time in history, what we have here from Hegel's perspective is the slow development of consciousness. Where is this consciousness headed? It's headed towards what Hegel refers to as absolute spirit. And that is ultimately the sense of Geist. Now, Geist in the German here is a term that we can think of as spirit, or in particular in Hegel's sense, as a sort of God. That is, God becomes consciousness, absolutely consciousness, through the slow development of the consciousness of beings on earth, in particularly human beings. And in particular, Hegel's interested in thinking about how social institutions play this role. And this is all headed into the direction of absolute freedom. So for Hegel, all of history is ultimately about the development of consciousness, absolute consciousness for absolute spirit, which is absolutely free. And this is the sort of general framework that Hegel uses to understand the significance and the meaning of the individual life over time. Now, all of this is occurring according to what we would refer to as the dialectical method. So let me read you a quote from Hegel here. There are three aspects in every thought which is logically real or true. Number one, the abstract rational form, which says that something is. Number two, the dialectical negation, which says what something is not. And three, the speculative concrete comprehension, in which A is also that which is not. In other words, A is not A. Now, these three aspects do not constitute three parts of logic, but are actually moments of everything that is logically real or true. They belong to every philosophical concept. Every concept is rational, is abstractly opposed to another, and is united in a comprehension together with its opposites. This is the definition of the dialectic. So, what we see here is that there's three movements in the dialectical method. What commentators have roughly said, and what Hegel himself talks about in the introduction to the philosophy of history, is that these three moments can be articulated as a moment of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, such that with every time there's a thesis, which is an abstract rational form of thought, right, that has with it its own negation, and this is its antithesis. But that what Hegel thinks happens through time over the course of history is that this method, as a conceptual logical method for thinking about the social practices of human existence, that this thesis antithesis tension resolves itself into a third concrete comprehension, a synthesis. And so you can think of history as proceeding along these grounds, where, for instance, you have one overriding thesis which develops into an antithesis, and this only gets resolved in Hegel's view historically through social forms of violence. So literally, through violence, the tension between the antithesis and the thesis and the antithesis resolves into the synthesis. For instance, think about, the tension that was. Let's use, for instance, the history of racial relationships within the United States as an example, where you have a thesis, right? You have an overriding supposition that there's one class of people that rule and are free, and that freedom is the reason why these people do what they do. But there's an antithesis here, which is namely, think of the slaveholder. I'm sorry, not the slave-holding class, but think of the slaves. That's the antithesis of those people who are free. The United States was founded upon the notion that all men are created free. But notice here that in the very history of the United States is this implicit tension between the freeman and the slave. But ultimately, this has to be resolved into a synthetic new movement. And ultimately, this is how history operates according to Hegel. Where is history going? It's going ultimately towards absolute spirit and absolute freedom and absolute consciousness. Okay, so before we go to, so this is what the dialectical method seems to refer to for Hegel. But this means, in a way of thinking about this, has very deep consequences. And one of the ways we can see it is also in Hegel's discussion that being and nothingness are actually the same thing. And this seems quite counterintuitive, but let's sort of take it in a sort of five-part step here. The first motion here is that take any object you want whatsoever and subtract from it all of its accidental qualities. We saw this sort of analysis in John Locke, you'll recall, where John Locke said, okay, I've got any object I experience it through these five senses at least. But if I subtract these senses, there should be something left. That's what Locke called matter. But Locke said we can never really know if it's really there, so we just assume it's there. Now, there's a sort of similarity and a parallelism in Hegel's discussion here. If we take any object and subtract all of these accidental qualities from it, what we're left with here is we're left with the concept that something exists. We're left with the concept of mere existence or being. So for instance, let's say I have this pen. If I subtract the color, my sight of it, I subtract my feeling of it, my smell of it, my taste of it, if I subtract all of these accidental qualities that I usually use to describe the pen, then what I'm left with is a pen that I don't experience. In other words, I'm left with the notion that something exists, but that existence is not something that can be known for me. Well, wait a second. What are the qualities of this mere existence? The answer, Hegel says, is that there are no qualities of this mere existence. And that's precisely because all of the qualities have been subtracted. But this means that when we say that being is left, being, therefore, has no determinations. So wait a second. That means that the being of something really is the same thing in its reference point as talking about the nothingness of something, right? Because being has no determinations, being is nothingness. So you can see here that the notion of being and nothingness are on the one hand opposites of each other, and yet somehow they both have a pathway into the other concept, right? So being implies nothingness, and nothingness, of course, implies being. So the idea of nothingness is derived from the idea of being. And so being is a passageway to nothingness and vice versa. This is a way of understanding the logical conception of dialectical negation that we have in Hegel. And the consequence of it is actually quite radical. And on the face of it, prima facie, it looks actually contradictory and inconsistent. But the point here is that, well, wait a second, being and nothingness are actually dialectical modalities of the same thing over time. Now, this will have large consequences ultimately when we try to apply this sort of notion of dialectical negation to something like the question of self-consciousness. Now, Hegel's doing a lot of different things here. His discussion of self-consciousness here, he wants to understand what does it mean for us to become not just conscious of the world, but to be conscious of ourselves in the world. What is the dialectical process that accounts for self-consciousness as such? Now, Hegel's discussion of self-consciousness is referred to as the master-slave dialectic, because we're going to see that Hegel essentially tries to understand the movement of self-consciousness formally in terms of a social interaction between the person who is lord and the person who is slave, or in terms of the German that he uses, lordship and bondage, the bondsman versus the lord. And we're going to see here that not only does Hegel narrativize his analysis of self-consciousness, but it's also related in terms of it being a sort of social practice of recognition for the other. So there's a lot of different things that are going on here. It's actually quite complex, I think. And there's a lot of different angles that one could take here. But I do want to emphasize that he tries to understand the development of self-consciousness as itself being a product of the social practice we have with others. So there's a lot of interesting things going on here, but it's a sort of narrativization of the way in which self-consciousness depends upon the other. Okay, so let's sort of jump into it. And I should say that even upon careful reading of Hegel's discussion here, it's quite complex and difficult to understand. So I have to say, I hope that my video here will explain this, or at least help you understand it. But I have also the strong feeling that you're going to have to really reflect upon this and read this on your own and mull it over to really get a sense of what he's talking about. So let's start out here with the quote. Now, he says, self-consciousness exists in itself and for itself in that and by the fact that it exists for another self-consciousness. That is to say, it is only by being acknowledged or recognized. So it's very interesting here. The first sort of general sense here is that self-consciousness is an effect of the fact that we can have recognition in the eyes of another person. So notice here that Hegel has created this dialectical opposition ultimately between the self on the one hand and the other on the other. Now the self is that thing which is itself in itself and for itself, right? Whereas the other is that which is recognized by the self but remains exterior to the self. There's a movement of sublation here that Hegel refers to, in which it, on the one hand, while the other resists the self recognizes that it is an object for the other in the other's consciousness, right? So think about here, you have two different beings, two persons. One of them is yourself and the other is another person, right? When you recognize that when you see that the other person recognizes you, that means that on the one hand, you recognize that you are something external for that other, right? But on the other hand, in terms of your recognition of the other's recognition, you actually subsume the other into yourself. So there's this sort of double movement which occurs in this tension between the self and the other. Hegel writes, first, it has lost its own self since it finds itself as an other being. Secondly, it has thereby sublated that other, for it does not regard the other as essentially real, but sees its own self in the other. So the notion here is that in this relationship we have between the self and the other, the self on the one hand recognizes the alterity of the other, but really the other is just used in terms of itself. So you have this sort of kind of duplicity in the way in which self-consciousness arises. That is, self-consciousness must therefore be a double relationship between the self and the other. Remember, the other exists independently for itself, right? And the self exists for itself. But it's this tension between the two in which they both recognize themselves in the face of the other, whereby self-consciousness can be produced, and it's out of this sort of this diachronic tension, I guess you might say. Hegel writes, the process then is absolutely the double process of both self-consciousness. Each sees the other do the same as itself. Each itself does what it demands on the part of the other, and for that reason does what it does, only so far as the other does the same. You can see here why I said Hegel is difficult to understand. The key here to think about here is that ultimately, in this tension between the other and the self, the middle term is self-consciousness. Now think about it for a moment, and I'm trying to divorce myself from utilizing Hegelian language here, so hopefully to make it comprehensible. Is think about this, right? That as a self, as a being, I exist in the world and I see things in the world. When we talk about self-consciousness, that means self-consciousness implies that I can somehow recognize myself in a movement that's outside of myself, right? This is on its face difficult to understand unless you articulate some sort of dynamic dialectical process like Hegel does. So, self consciousness is really, if you will, this space that I can operate because I recognize myself in the recognition of the other. It's this middle term which allows me to see myself as an objective presence rather than myself as being a subjective presence. Notice here that with regard to the history of philosophy, a part of which this video is a part of, here we see a really complicated sense of the Cartesian sense of subjectivity really being developed in a way that's quite complex but important for thinking about not only the history of how Descartes' philosophy influences later philosophy, but in terms of the way in which philosophers later, by the time of Hegel, would begin to conceptualize both consciousness, history, and social relations. Okay, so how can we make sense of this? Well, it means that self-consciousness is primarily simply existence for the self. Self-identity by exclusion of every other from itself. So it takes its essential nature and the absolute object to the ego, and in this immediacy and in the bare fact of its self-existence, it is an individual. It seems in this quote, and by the way, this is a very sort of, I think, opaque passage of Hegel's here, but I think an important one. We see here that ultimately the individuality of one's self-consciousness is consequent upon this dialectical tension we have with the other. So in other words, the other's consciousness is an antithesis of my own consciousness. So self-consciousness consists in showing itself as a pure negation of its objective form. So you can see here is that if we start with the thesis of the self, it's through the thesis of the self, the thesis, if we think of the thesis here as the self, it's through the antithesis of the other that the synthetic movement of self-consciousness can arise. So, this means that the dialectical struggle one has with the other can be characterized, if you're to try to turn it into a social narrative, as a type of struggle. What is this struggle? What is this a struggle about? Well, for Hegel, it's ultimately a struggle over objective truth. In other words, the tension between the self and the other is a tension over what exactly my own individuality really objectively amounts to. Everything's on the line. It is a struggle for the objective truth of my own existence. And so that means that for Hegel, the very act of recognition socially or through a social process, and the very act of recognition in terms of self-consciousness can be characterized as a sort of life and death struggle. Um, Hegel doesn't mince any words here. Everything is on the line. So we can understand this as a sort of trial by death. In other words, the self is trying to understand its own objective truth in the presence of the other through a tension in which, if that objective truth is not resolved, the self will lose itself. The self will die. So, in other words, in the same way, each here being the self and the other, must aim at the death of the other, right? So, you have its self and the other, but the self wants to rectify its objectivity as opposed to the other, but this other is also self-conscious itself, and it's trying to do the same thing, right? So what you have here is that they're both aiming at the death of each other, but as it risks its own life thereby, for that other is to it of no more worth than itself. The other's reality is presented to the former as an external other, as outside of itself. It must cancel this externality. So we have this sort of life and death struggle out of which we can understand what consciousness is. Self-consciousness, I mean. Okay? So the trial of death cancels both its true self for itself. Right? That's because through this struggle, a new synthetic thing evolves. And that means that both are lost, actually. So Hegel writes, but along with this, there vanishes from the play of change the essential moment, that is, that of breaking up into extremes with opposite characteristics, and the middle term collapses into a lifeless unity which is broken up into lifeless extremes, merely existent and not opposed. So, experience will ultimately reveals, the experience that one has with the other ultimately reveals to consciousness that life is essential to it as pure self consciousness. Okay? So here's where we get into the master slave dialectic more properly put. We can understand the self as being a master, we can understand the other as being the slave or as the bondsman. Why would we think of it in that way? Well, the self is trying to appropriate itself in the face of the other, which means that the relationship between the self and the other is one whereby the other is treated as something merely for the self. In other words, the other is treated as a slave for the self's sense of being its master. Now, the master is, or the self, is a consciousness that exists for itself. That's why we would call it a master, right? And this means that the master is related to the bondsman mediately through its own independent existence. So, but it's in these two moments, it's in these two moments that the master gets his recognition through an other consciousness. That is, remember, the other, it's not only is it the master is trying to appropriate through the recognition of the other their objective truth, but the slave is doing the same thing. But the slave, in Hegel's sense, is characterized by a sense by which both become inverted. So the master is actually a slave to the slave, but insofar as the master needs the slave has a sort of independence beyond the master. And what this means for Hegel is that the synthetic movement that results as a consequence of the tension between the master and the slave is ultimately a consequence of an inversion for each. He writes, we have thus here this moment of recognition, that is, that the other consciousness cancels itself as self-existent, and ipso facto, itself does what the first does to it. In the same way, we have the other moment that this action on the part of the second is the action proper of the first, for what is done by the bondsman is properly an action on the part of the master, not the matter, but master. The latter exists for himself, that is his essential nature. He is the negative power without qualification. So think of it in terms of the basic sense here between, I'm going to use my own personal example. Instead of thinking of the master-slave, think about the parent and the child, right? In a certain sense, the parent is external to the child, but the parent ultimately is organized towards the child in the sense that the parent reverses, the parent needs the child and is dependent upon the child in a way in which the child is independent of the parent. I actually don't know if that was actually described very well or not, but I think that it's somewhat helpful, I'm hoping, in terms of understanding the way in which the master gets inverted and the slave gets inverted. And this precisely is the consequence of this dialectical negation. And this is what the synthetic means. And this is why the master and the slave both get resolved into some sort of new being, some sort of new consciousness. That is, it's through this process by which freedom is enacted. Freedom comes through negation. Hegel writes, the truth of the independent consciousness is accordingly the consciousness of the bondsman, that is, the consciousness of the slave. And this doubtless appears in the first instance outside of itself, and not as the truth of self-consciousness, but just as the lordship or the master showed its essential nature to be the reverse of what it wants to be, so too bondage or slavery will, when completed, pass into the opposite of what it immediately is. Being a consciousness repressed within itself, it will enter into itself and changed round into the real and true independence. That is, it's all the notion of freedom here, the notion, or let's put it this way, the progress towards absolute freedom is actually comes through the slave, not the master. That is, because the slave needs the master, the slave is in a certain sense, the master is in a certain sense enslaved to the slave because the master needs the slave. Whereas the slave negates the master, and this is actually a movement of freedom that goes beyond and excels past the master's consciousness. So self-consciousness is this movement which gets resolved as a form of freedom, right? So here we start to see the ways in which Hegel links both history and consciousness to freedom as being a social relationship, which is ultimately grinding towards what Hegel thinks of as absolute spirit. Now, what I've tried to do here is give you a brief summation as best I can, and really, I think probably a poor summation of Hegel's metaphysical perspective here. Now, Hegel is such a rigorously difficult philosopher that there's a lot more that needs to be said here, but I'm hoping that this video at least helps to resolve some of the ways in which Hegel's work furthers the movement between transcendental idealism into absolute idealism. Okay? Thank you very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you guys online. Bye.